Hi, Prem. Looks like you're the only one here so far. Maybe we'll get some more folks joining in a few, but hope everything's been going well with this week's material so far. Do you have any questions that you'd like me to go over in this session? Any problems you've been running into? If there aren't any questions, then as usual, I've got some miscellaneous tips and tricks I can show you. So since this week, the material focuses on clusters, we can talk about adding some rotational initial velocity to your clustered pieces in an RBD sim. So I'll just create a new example here off to the side. And let's just create, I don't know, I'll just create a box for now. Or maybe I'll make it just slightly more interesting. Use a classic rubber toy. And let's break this up into some fractured pieces. So I'll just scatter some points. And just start by doing a basic Voronoi on this. We'll try, we don't need too many points for this demo. I'll try maybe 20 points, that should be fine. And we'll do a standard Voronoi fracture. Connect our geometry to that and the scatter points. And let's see what that fracture looks like. All right. So if we want to add some initial rotation to this geometry, then it's going to be a bit of a problem, because if we have these separate RBD pieces and you try to add a W attribute, then it's just going to make each individual piece rotate around its own centroid. So just to make that a little bit more clear, that W attribute might take this piece and have it rotating like so, and this piece rotating like so. Even if you try to create a consistent W attribute on all the pieces, then it won't make the whole thing rotate that way. Each individual piece will be trying to do that, and it won't necessarily result in a rotation that you expect. So the trick that I use to add initial rotation to clustered chunks like this is to pack it, apply the rotation while it's packed, and then unpack it, and all the pieces will pick up the velocity based on the angular velocity of the double packed piece. So that might sound really confusing with that explanation, but it should make a whole lot more sense once we set that up in a demo. So we of course have to pack this geometry. This should give us a decent name attribute, which it does. So I'll pack that up. And let's also take a look at the constraints that come with that. And let's transform this whole thing upwards. I'm assuming that this is also a good thing to watch out for. If we just transform our pieces like this, I'm assuming that this will not work correctly in the sim if our constraints don't start in the same position. And that's one of the reasons that can be really beneficial to use that RBD pack SOP if you want to move your objects around. So let's drop in our RBD pack and connect our geometry to that and the constraints. And now we should be able to transform this whole thing without it being a problem. So I'll just bring it up here, off to the side, maybe rotate that a little bit. Sure, that'll be fine. All right. Now let's set up a basic simulation for this. We'll first need to do an RBD unpack in order to get access to the geometry and the constraints. And we've been using nulls to reference the the constraint geometry and packed pieces in the DOPNet, I have been setting up, a sim pieces null and a constraints null. If you want to, though, you can just use direct connections to the DOPNet and tell your simulation objects to look for those DOPNet inputs. So if you dive inside the DOPNet here, let's create a gravity force and our bullet solver and hook that up, and an RBD packed object. And on this RBD packed object, instead of the SOP, you could just tell this to use the first context geometry. And let's see if our sim start frame is set up correctly. All right, that's all fine. Let's also add a ground here. So I'll merge that in. I usually merge this before the gravity, although I don't think it matters. Standard ground plane, and let's see what that looks like. Oh. So this is a common problem. The default merge behavior is for the left input to affect the right. And you can see that our RBD packed object and bullet solver are on the left of this merge. So in order to have the ground plane affecting the RBDs, you'll have to select that merge and hit Shift-R to reverse those inputs. So now that's more correct. Now let's try adding some initial W to this. So let's just add in a point wrangle to our geometry pieces. I'll add some initial velocity as well. Say V at V equals, I'll try just shooting it upwards in Y a little bit. So maybe 0, 5, 0. Let's try that. And V at W equals, and I'll just give this an initial Y spin. We'll try 0, 10, 0. So it just should spin on the Y axis. Now this probably won't do anything yet, because by default it won't inherit velocity. And you can set up the inherit velocity point attribute on these pieces to tell them to inherit it, or you could just turn it on in the RBD packed object here, like so. And we should see that working now. Let's set this a bit slower. I'll turn on real-time playback so we can see this a bit better. Actually, it looks like we're getting some realistic spin out of this. I would expect it not to work properly with all those RBD packed pieces. The thing is, when you have all of the angular velocities, it might push things in, in some direction, because the spinning RBD pieces that we can see here are going to exert some force from their spin, so it will have some sort of dynamic effect on that. But the way that and we can compare the results with the technique that I typically use to what we get out of this. I will be interested and surprised if it looks the same, because I wouldn't expect us to be able to set a reliable explicit spin value on this. Like if you want to art direct this spin direction, let's see if it looks much different if we spin it on the x-axis instead. Actually, it's working a lot better than I expected to. But, so the interesting thing here is if let's take a look at the initial velocities on this. Normally what I typically do in these situations, because I'm curious if something might have changed in the way this is treated in 17 or 17.5, but typically when I have a clustered piece that I want to add initial rotation to, I'll pack it up, add the W, and then unpack it. So let's visualize just the point velocities to start. So I'll drop in an add node to delete all the primitives. Oh, I see what's happening here. That's why it's working. So I made a big mistake in this pack here. This is packed up all as one piece. So that might be why we're seeing this rotation working as we expect it to. This is the, the problem with going through demos quick. It's easy to miss some of these important steps. So that was just being treated as one packed object before. So of course, the rotations will be predictable. So now that I've packed it by name and we now have all 36 pieces, let's take a look at that DOP.NET again to see if this is giving us that predictable rotation. Well, first of all, everything's breaking up. All the pieces are rotating like we expect them to. They're all spinning in that x-axis, but they're not, they're totally breaking up when we want this to be a glued together chunk. Maybe we're going to set this up so it just breaks on impact with the ground. So let's add our constraint network to this. And for the SOP path on this, instead of using a null, just for the sake of showing you another option, I'm going to tell this to use the second context geometry, which is where we connected the constraints here. And then we'll set up a glue constraint and wire that into the second input of the constraint network. And I'll just call this glue. And maybe I'll set an infinite strength of -1. And let's jump out of here. And this probably won't work yet because we haven't told this constraint network what type of constraint to create. So these constraints don't have that constraint name defined yet. So we'll drop in our RBD constraint properties. And this default constraint name of glue will match what we've set on this data name in the glue constraint relationship here. So now it should work correctly. Let's rewind and step through. All right, so it looks like it's not respecting our infinite strength because I assume the strength on the RBD constraint properties is just overriding what's in the DOP.NET. So let's set this to -1. All right, let's see, what are we doing wrong here? Looks like our constraint network is complaining about something. So anytime that you run into issues with your constraints, I always recommend you go inside the DOP.NET and turn off the display geometry for your RBD packed object, and you should see your constraint network in here. But we're not seeing that. So that's a big red flag that there's something going wrong with this setup. So it's possible this second context geometry is not, detecting this correctly. Let's try using an explicit null reference instead. I'll call this constraints and see if this works any better. I'll disconnect that from the DOP.NET, go to the constraint network, tell this to use a SOP path, and I'll point to that constraints null I've just created. And that's not working either. Let's see, what are we doing wrong? We might not, the other thing that's a common problem when your constraints aren't working correctly is that the names on your pieces don't match the names on your constraints. I'm guessing that's the problem here. So, sure enough, if you look at our packed geometry, and as you've probably heard me say before, I actually really like running into problems in these live sessions so that you can see what some of the common issues are. And on this pack, we have no names in the output. So if you turn on the transfer attributes for the name, you'll see now we have those 36 unique name attributes on our prims. And I don't think this will work unless we promote it to points. Sometimes I like testing things to see if if the setups are flexible enough to work without, the typical ways I set things up, to see if any of my steps are optional instead of 100% required. So sure enough, we have the names on our prims, but it looks like our constraint network is still not working. You'll see it's not showing up in here. And that's because, at least I believe this is the problem, any attributes that you care about on your RBD pieces should always be on the points. You can, in an RBD sim, you can think about RBDs as almost complicated particles, or just particles with an advanced collision shape instead of just point particle collisions. So that's essentially what they are, and any attributes that we care about should be promoted to points. So drop in an attribute promote, original class primitive, new class point, and select that name. And then we can dive inside, and now you can see that constraint network is being created properly. So let's turn our display geometry back on. Actually, let's try not only displaying, well, let's turn it off for a second. Let me flip this back to the second context geometry, just, because I wanted to set this version of the sim up a little bit different than we've been doing it in some of the videos. So yep, that is working properly. All right, let's bring our display geometry back. So now this is all one piece, except for some of these fracture objects that are completely separate from the main body here are not connected, which we can talk about more in a moment. It looks like all of these pieces are getting a decent rotation. Let's see if it's predictable if we introduce a Y twist on this as well. Because when all of these pieces are rotating individually, it is possible that they're all still exerting a force on each other to push this in the correct direction. So if you have a whole bunch of pieces going like this, and like that, and like that in terms of their rotation values, then perhaps that's enough to coax this whole thing into moving in that direction. I didn't think that was typically the case. Prem asked, what's the difference between rigid body solver and bullet solver? It's a good question. You can use, if you use the rigid body solver and have this set to bullet, it should be doing the exact same thing. Yeah, if you dive inside, a lot of the things you see in DOPS are really wrappers around some more simple solvers. So this rigid body solver, if you go inside there, you'll see that it's using a bullet solver internally. So essentially it's exactly the same thing. It's using the same thing. It just gives you the option of picking which solver you want. And I've not heard about anyone ever using RBD instead of bullet in a long, long time. If anybody has been using it professionally, I'd be curious to hear about it, because bullet seems like quite the standard, at least for any places that use Houdini. But still a good question. Anyway, so this looks like that's working more or less correct. If we want to introduce some Y rotation, let's see if that is also respected by all these pieces. So we'll add a Y twist of 10 as well. Okay, it looks like it's being reflected in our constrained piece better than I'd expect. But just in case you are less lucky with your clustered together pieces, maybe in certain cases we won't get this lucky with it being picked up nicely by all the pieces, this technique could still be useful. So right now, if we look at the point velocities for this geometry here, you'll see these velocities are just going upwards. And this doesn't show us the initial angular velocity, it just shows the directional velocity. So what you can do is if you take your RBD geometry, and these are 36 packed pieces, if you repack them as one piece, you can then apply some velocity and angular velocity. I'll call it V and W. We'll do the same thing on this one packed piece. So I'll set the V to 0 for the moment, and we'll set the W to just spin on Y. So this is just one packed object with one point at the center. And we have essentially no linear velocity being shown, even though there's some angular velocity on this object. And if we unpack that object now and tell it to transfer the V attribute, Houdini is smart enough to take the W into account. So we have a 0 value for V and a W rotating 10 degrees in Y. And when you unpack that and transfer that V down, you'll see we no longer have W, but these underlying points have velocities based on the rotation of this singular packed object here. So that can be a very useful technique if you ever need to get angular velocities onto onto linear point velocities. And I found this useful in some cases where I couldn't give clustered sections in angular. So yeah, I am curious if something's changed or if we're just getting lucky here. But yeah, it's a very handy technique. So another thing that I briefly touched upon in the constraint videos for this week is allowing the constraints to break below a certain Y value. I'm trying to remember how deep we got into it in the video. Yeah, we can just go over this a little bit here. So if we want to break this, actually, you know what? Another interesting thing is breaking this based on some grouping geometry that we definitely didn't talk about in the video. So let's say we want to animate the breaking of this at a certain frame. So we've got this sim here, and maybe we want, this could be more useful in the context of an entire building where you want to art direct the constraints falling apart at a certain position at a certain time. So if this is the position at frame 1022, let's create a sphere to direct the breaking of these constraints. So I'll drop in a sphere here. And let's display that and template the RBDs. And make the sphere a bit bigger. All right, that'll do. And let's keyframe this at that position. And let's move it away until that point. So I'll go just a handful of frames earlier, and we'll move this sphere away and keyframe that again. All right. So that we'll use this sphere to break those constraints. Now, if you go into the DOPNet, we'll drop in a SOP solver to handle that constraint breaking. So SOP solver into the third input. And then inside that SOP solver, we're going to use this relationship geometry. Now, you can use SOP solvers to process regular DOPS geometry or impact data. And this relationship geometry is the constraints. So in the constraint context here, we want to make sure that this relationship geometry is what we output. And don't worry if you haven't gotten too deep into this week's material yet. If some of this doesn't if it feels like it's jumping ahead a little bit, once you get to the end of this week's lectures, then this will all make a little bit more sense. This is also kind of a quick little preview of some of the stuff we get into later this week, if you haven't gotten there yet. Anyway, so in this object merge, we have our constraints. And as I mentioned in the videos, in the SOP solver, the constraints are always shown at their rest position. Now, Bullet keeps track of this data internally, and it knows where all the positions of the constraints are, but we should never update the positions here because that can really mess things up. But if we want to check if these pieces are within a sphere, to break these constraints based on grouping, then we'll have to temporarily move them into their current simulation position. So I'll use a wrangle to do that, hook the relationship geometry up to the wrangle, and our dop geometry here, I find that this never seems to work when we're in the constraint context, at least. This always seems to give us a warning and no geometry unless we explicitly specify the name in this object mask here. So I'll call this the object mask RBD packed object 1. So that will bring in our pieces correctly. And these, you'll see, are updating in the actual sim positions. So for our relationship geometry, we can, actually, you know what? In the videos, I used an attribute wrangle to look up the point position for the matching names in our dop geometry. But actually, I believe there's an easier way. I really love, using live Q&As to show you different ways of accomplishing the same thing. So I think this will work as well. You can try using an attribute copy. And in this attribute copy, we're going to copy the position, but we want to match by attributes. And the attribute name will be matching, we'll match by the attribute called name. So let's see, is this updating? Yep, sure enough, that works correctly. What I've done often in the past, which is a little bit more complicated, is to use an attribute wrangle and find the point number of the matching piece in the dop geometry, then get that point position and set it in the wrangle. But oftentimes, you'll find easier ways to streamline the process as you work, and this is a little bit easier. So you've got that attribute position copied over, and now we can object merge in our sphere to check if our pieces are within that object. So let's use a normal object merge. We'll pull that in from, see how many times we have to jump up with that ... syntax. ... and sphere 1. So that should bring it in. Yep, there we go. All right, so now we can group this geometry based on that sphere. So I'll drop in a group node and hook up this constraint geometry to that, and hook our sphere up to the second input. So right now we should be grouping nothing. Actually, sorry, we haven't changed any settings on the group. Right now it's grouping everything, all the primitives. Let's call this group break. That will be a point group. Turn the base group off, bounding regions on, and the bounding object on. So now, looks like we have 3 objects in the break group. And so, yeah, it looks like the stray piece of this character, this little rubber toy, has fallen into our sphere there. So we should see these constraints break before the other ones based on that. So we've got this grouping here. Now, in order to break the constraints based on this object grouping here, we'll need to copy that group over to our relationship geometry. So we can just use our group copy SOP and drop that onto our regular relationship geometry stream. And we'll connect this group SOP to that. And we can turn off primitive groups and edge groups and select break from the point groups dropdown. So it looks like this frame, there's nothing. Let's rewind and go to a frame where we expect to see something getting broken. There we go. I think that's in the sphere. Is that right? Yep, okay. So just to make sure that group copy is working, sure enough, we have 3 points in that break group. Actually, before we copy this, ultimately, when we're working with constraints, we want to work with the primitives. So RBDs we're considering almost like fancy particles and dealing mostly with point attributes, whereas constraints we're dealing mostly with prim attributes. So I'm actually going to promote this break group to prims. Oops, sorry, we don't want attribute promote. We want group promote. And we'll wire this up there and select break, convert from auto to primitives. So you can see we now have those 2 primitives in that break group. And we have to change our group copy here. I'll turn off point, turn on primitive, and select break from that dropdown. And, you know, I'm actually curious. I always do this detection with intermediate groups. So we could try directly adding the broken group. So to break constraints, you would add them to the broken group in this stream here. Typically, I do that in a wrangle, where I'll say at group underscore broken equals 1 based on some condition. Typically, I don't do copying of the broken group directly. I usually do all my checks in the wrangle, and I'm just used to working that way. But like I said, especially when we're doing these live sessions, I like to experiment with slightly different ways of working to see if you know, things work the same way, or if there are issues with doing this outside of my usual methods. Let's try it this way. Okay, it's giving us a warning converting or setting these this object-based grouping to the broken group, because broken is a group that exists by default on relationship geometry. That's how Bullet keeps track of which constraints have broken and are no longer included in the sim. So that might be a harmless warning. And let's try copying over that group. Let's see. So we have 2 prims in this broken group here. It doesn't look like it's overwriting it when we do the group copy, though. It's interesting. Maybe it doesn't let us do a group copy if that already exists. All right, I guess, yeah, from the looks of it. Oh, wait, sorry. There's this group name conflict here on the group copy. So you could tell it to skip the group, which is the default, which is why it's not doing anything. But we can also tell it to overwrite. So now it will completely overwrite that broken group. The reason I'm a little paranoid about this is because if I'm not sure if it'll mess things up if pieces are part of the broken group, and then if we have our sphere move away so that the primitives are no longer inside that sphere, if they're removed from the broken group, if that messes things up. Hopefully it's not a confusing way to put it. If you want me to clarify that anymore, just let me know. But in any case, we're adding prims to the broken group based on the sphere. So let's jump out of that SOP solver and step through the sim here and see what it looks like. Let me move this chat window out of the way a little bit. Not sure if you can see the chat window on your end. Okay, so you can see these pieces should be breaking up before the others. Sometimes it's hard to tell just based on the display geometry. Okay, I see what's going on here. It looks like when we're overwriting the broken group in the sim entirely, you can see how it allowed these pieces to break for the moment. But once the sphere passed through those pieces and it's no longer, these pieces no longer lie within that sphere, then these pieces are no longer in that broken group. So you can see these constraints are reactivated at that point. At least that's what it looks like is happening here. So we have to be very careful not to completely overwrite the broken group. We can add to the broken group anytime we want, but yeah, we never want to remove something from that group once it's created. You can see these areas as well. Yeah, that does some really weird things. It's kind of an interesting effect. You could potentially, if you're trying to do something special, I suppose, you could come up with some sort of very interesting effect by breaking constraints and then reactivating them by removing them from the broken group. That's kind of an interesting idea. It looks kind of cool at speed, actually. It's kind of an interesting effect. Kind of glad we did that. So if you don't want that, if you just want things to stay broken, which is typically the case in a destruction sim, then we don't want to copy over this broken group directly and overwrite, what's considered broken at any given time. I'll use some intermediate group like we did a moment ago. We called this break. So now we'll copy over this break group instead. And then in a wrangle, I'll check to see if an object is in the break group, then add it to the broken group. So anytime an object is broken, it's being added to the broken group, but otherwise we're not changing the group at all. So we'll say if at group underscore break, and because this group attribute is either 0 or 1, you probably don't even need to check to see if it's equal to 0 in this if statement. You should be able to just leave it at if group underscore break without any, conditional statement there. So now let's check out this result and see if this, allows those pieces to stay broken. And looks like they're not breaking at all. Let's see what we might have done wrong here. All right, maybe that just this if group underscore break isn't working quite like that. We'll say if group underscore break equals 1. Let's see if that works any better. Also, if you don't want to dive back and forth as much, you can just pin your viewport to the DOPNet or to SOPs, and then just dive back inside here and edit this without jumping back and forth. No, it looks like that's not doing it. Let's go to a frame where we expect to see some breaking happening. All right, we have our sphere templated, so actually I'm not seeing that sphere in here. Oh, sorry. So yeah, we can't see the sphere, of course, because we had our template display on. So let's find a frame where we expect breaking to happen. So sure enough, all right, so this is a frame where it's detecting pieces in that sphere. It's setting break to a value of 2. Oh, I see what we did wrong. All right, so if you middle mouse on this geometry, any of these geometry sections here, you can see that we have both a point group and a primitive group called break, and the same for broken. And that's because on this attribute wrangle, we left this set to points. And we're dealing with primitive groups here. And like I said, most of the time when working with constraints, most of your information and work is done on primitives. So that is also true for these groups. So now if we set that wrangle to run over primitives instead, let's jump out of the DOPNet here. Now hopefully we'll see this working correctly. Lots of examples of what not to do in this demo, which I think hopefully makes it an extra useful demo. Cool. So it looks like, we're getting that breaking based on that sphere, and things are staying broken with this new setup. And this can be really useful for your buildings. So for example, let's go to, let's bring up some of the frames from my version of the shot. And pull in maybe a quick version of the comp. So let's just say that you had some constrained pieces, perhaps in this area here. Let me bring up the pen tool. Maybe you had, this section of geometry here that you wanted to have a delayed break off or something. You could just take a sphere and animate that sphere across the geometry here and use that as a breaker object. And you can art direct exactly where those constraints break with some animated geometry. This is extra useful as well with soft constraints. So if you look at the soft constraint demo from this week, you'll see there are a whole bunch of pieces kind of swinging and wobbling around. There's a section of the building that stays intact kind of here, and it kind of wobbles back and forth a little bit. So with soft constraints, especially because they're moving around quite a bit, if you were to use one of these breaker spheres and animate that across here, you would see these constraints start to detach and things start to droop down more and more as you break the constraints across that sphere line there. With the example over here, if this was glue, for example, you wouldn't notice anything falling off until you removed all the constraints on these pieces. You'd have to remove any behind the piece as well. You'd have to make sure you get that removed all around that section. So you could use maybe a box or a disc to totally detach a section with this technique. But if there's a single constraint line that's still connecting one of these pieces to the rest of the building, if you miss just one line, then this will still be considered perfectly constrained. Whereas with the soft constraints, like I said, as soon as you start breaking some of those, then you'll see, with that soft constraint motion, these pieces start to sag down more and more. At least you should see that as these constraints are removed. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of how you can use this technique practically, instead of just on a rubber toy. All right, so we've got, looks like just a little under 15 minutes left here, and still no more questions in the chat, which is fine. So let's take a look at a couple of the new SOPs available. In 17.5, I haven't messed with this at all. There's this constraint from curve SOP. So let's dive up to our setup here to test that out. I don't know if I'll be able to figure it out straight away since I've never used it before, but let's find out. I thought it just had constraint in the name. I thought it was just called constraint from curve or something. Oh yeah, RBD constraints from, there's curves and lines. Let's drop that in and see what that's expecting. So if we look at the hints based on these input names here, there's our geometry, constraints, and proxies. You see that's pretty consistent with lots of our different RBD related nodes. It's the same as our pack and our constraint properties. So you're really meant to be able to, just chain a lot of these RBD related nodes together. And it should help to keep, your setup consistent across your fracture, constraints, and proxies. Although if you want to, I assume with most constraint SOPs, you don't necessarily need to have the fracture geometry connected. Although this constraints from curves might be an exception. Let's see. So that third input there is going to be a curve. So without having experimented with this at all before, let's try to draw a curve on this object to connect the arm to the body of this object. Because you saw before, these are just immediately falling apart. So let's create our draw curve tool, and I'll connect our geometry to that. This is just that packed geometry. Typically when I've drawn curves on geometry, I've done it on unpacked geo. I've never tried doing it on packed geometry before, so let's see if that works. So under projection, go to this projection drop down and select geometry. So that will allow you to draw the curve on whatever's coming into that first input. So if we just draw a curve like this, like so, maybe I'll try doing another one here. Try another one here and there. And maybe we'll see if we can get this to constrain these little horn things or whatever they are to his head. All right. I don't know if this is what we're meant to do. If it is that simple, then big props to Side Effects for making a pretty cool intuitive thing. Let's see if it is that, oops. Let's see if it is actually that simple. So right now the connection type is specifying hinges. That would probably give you a constraint centered at the connection point between pieces. Center of mass would probably give you a glue style constraint connecting these centroids. Let's try that one. And let's try this use curve geometry option. It looks like, you can see when you turn that on, well, let's visualize this constraint from curves thing. Let's see what's the warning here. I really should be checking the docs on this before diving in, but I'm always kind of curious to see how obvious it is to use the new stuff, just to see how intuitive it is immediately. So turn on this use curve geometry, and you can see that the SOP is doing something with those curves. Let's check out, let's drop a null on this constraint output there to see what this looks like. And turn off the template display on our geometry. So here we have 66 polys in our constraints. Here we have 65. So it looks like it's creating only one constraint for us. But it looks like the search radius here is pretty small. So if we start increasing that, it looks like, it's hard to tell. I see what's going on here. It looks like we have to be a little bit more precise with our curve, perhaps. Turn our max connections up a little bit. Yeah, if we start to increase that search radius, you'll see it's connecting these pieces to the adjacent geometry. Let's Yeah, it's not very obvious. Let's check the docs here in case I'm missing anything. It looks like we did it, but I'm curious how much these results compare to what we'd get out of normal connect adjacent pieces. Check the docs in case I'm missing something obvious. So it creates point constraints between points on the geometry of nearby pieces within a search radius. Huh. I guess it's just looking for doing that. It might be doing something like a connect adjacent pieces within the area defined by this curve. In any case, yeah, you can experiment with that, see if you find it useful. Most of the time, I prefer workflows where I don't have to manually do things. At least for the constraint setup, I like to keep that procedural. I do like a lot of manual workflows, like manually specifying cluster groups and that sort of thing. But yeah, I'm sure you might find this useful, particularly for dynamic rigs or something. And yeah, I'll have to experiment with this a little bit more, and maybe I can give you a better breakdown on it's, where it's useful. So hopefully that was semi-helpful. But yeah, all the other constraint breaking stuff is, constraint breaking techniques are very useful. Like I mentioned in the video, one of the common uses of these SOP solver constraint breaking techniques is to delete constraints or strongly weaken them when they get close to the ground. So I highly encourage you to experiment with that. Also, just a quick heads up on this constraint from curves option. Looks like we have some more options for, or some tips in the viewport for the controls to place hinges. This looks like it could be really helpful for mechanical rigs in particular. So if you have, a robot that you need to do a dynamic rig for, or some sort of a ragdoll, then this looks like it might be a convenient way to quickly place those. So yeah, if anyone's looking for an extra experimental project, highly encourage you to experiment with this to try creating some sort of a ragdoll basic RBD proxy sim or something. So it looks like a cool addition in 17.5. So yeah, unless there are any more questions, I think we'll call it a night or a morning or an afternoon, wherever you are. For me, I'm calling it a night on this. But as usual, if anyone has any questions, feel free to shout it in the forum or drop me an email. And hope everything goes well with adding the clusters to your simulation this week. And I'll look forward to seeing what all of your sims look like with all of those clusters added. So good luck, everyone.